This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Smaranda Dochia, and in this episode of AI, Ethics and Trust in Coaching, we turn to an area that can feel complex, technical, and overwhelming. That is data protection, regulation, and AI governance. AI is already touching the coaching journey. Coaching may use it to prepare questions, transcribe conversations, summarize notes, identify themes, or support clients between sessions. Organizations are also introducing AI into their leadership development, learning, HR, and internal coaching. But when information about a client enters the AI space, where does it go? Who can access it? Is it stored or used to train a model? And what does the client need to know, and where does the coach's responsibility begin? To discuss all of this, I am joined today by Colin Cosgrove, a coach and AI governance specialist with an extensive experience in global technology, and Amber Foster, a lawyer, board leader, and AI governance practitioner working at the intersection of technology, organizational decision-making, and human capability. Together, we make the legal landscape practical. We explore GDPR, the AI EU Act, data flows, provider terms, transparency, consent, contracting, and the point at which a seemingly low-risk coaching tool may become part of a much higher-risk organizational system. This episode is not about turning coaches into lawyers. It is about helping us ask better questions, recognize where AI is touching our work, and take proportionate responsibility before sensitive information enters systems that we may not fully understand. Thank you so much both for coming today and joining me for this conversation. Great pleasure to be here today with Amber Foster and Colin Cosgrove. It's a very important conversation that we are going to have together today, so I hope our audience will benefit a lot from what we are discussing in the next 40 minutes or so. You are both coming to AI from different but completely complementary perspectives. Colin through technology, governance, and coaching, and Amber through law, organizational leadership, and human capability. What first made each of you realize that AI adoption was creating legal and governance questions that professionals were not yet prepared to answer?
Thank you so much for having us. At the start, actually, when I first started playing around with ChatGPT, before I even had access to any work tools, I immediately thought, if this is used in a workplace, we're going to have to use it really carefully. So these tools are powerful, they're amazing, but actually we really need to think carefully about how we deal with people's data in these tools. So pretty much from the start, I'd say.
Colin?
Yeah, and thank you for having me. Delighted to be here for this important conversation. Likewise, early on, and I think where the realization hit hardest is just understanding the capability and the speed of how some of these AI tools develop and that natural personal inclination of all of us to follow the tool and follow the innovation. And I think that's where you quickly realize, wow, I'm 10 steps ahead here. And that definitely happened for me in the early days of playing around with ChatGPT and understanding how it could add value to some of my training deliveries, coaching conversations, etc. And I come from about 20 years experience in global tech as well. So I've seen the evolution of how quickly things move. And personally, I was always really fascinated by taking a user-first approach in all my work. So that gave me the inspiration early on to say, topics like governance and compliance are absolutely critical in the context of the speed of how these tools are developing.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that, Colin? What's been your journey that you got into compliance and governance now?
Initially, I would say several years ago, I actually thought topics like data privacy and compliance were really hard to get to grips with, almost boring to an extent. But as I mentioned, as I progressed through my journey in global tech, I was really interested in how big tech was perceived externally from a competition point of view. And as I mentioned there, I always took a user-first approach in all my work. So the role of compliance was critical in all of this. So actually, I eventually moved myself onto a team where that was the strategic function, essentially, which was actually helping roll out Google's first AI ads product in Europe and making sure it was compliant with EU legislation, working on a big shopping decision as well back from 2017. So these were topics I worked on. And as a coach, naturally, also, I started thinking about some of these questions within the coaching journey, within the coaching interaction. So that's really what led me to this point, I suppose.
Thank you for that. I'll come back to you about that and how I hear coaches feel about all of this. But I just wanted to bring in Amber first. Amber, you're coming from a law background. What brought you to where you're at today? And can you tell us a little bit as well where you are at today?
Of course. So I've been a lawyer for many, many years now, typically in-house. So helping organisations implement tech has been part of my day job for many, many years. And through that, sort of issues of data protection, GDPR compliance. And I also had a non-executive career as well. So I've chaired boards as well. So really thinking about governance and how do organisations make decisions is a really interesting topic that I've always thought about, that decision-making process. And then we see AI, which seems so human in how we interact with it. And I immediately thought, well, we need to really think about the autonomy that we let this technology have and the amount of agency that we give this technology. Because in order for AI to be successful, we have to give up some of our own decision making. We're going to have to let it do some things for us. Otherwise, what's the point? We can do it ourselves. So that idea of how much do we give to the machine, what's right, led me to think I'm going to get into AI governance. So became an AI governance practitioner and started to work with both startups and big globals about that. How do we take this amazing technology, get the best out of it, but also make sure that we don't give too much agency to it? So where is that line drawn? And I think that's where I started to get fascinated with it. And at the same time, my business that I run as well is about human capabilities. So how does it work when AI meets humans? What does that look like? Where do we give too much? Where don't we challenge? Where do we come a cropper with automation bias? All these sorts of things were going around in my head at the time, which is why I think it's a really important conversation to be having.
And that's why we're here today. And a lot of the things that you are saying, they sound very abstract for coaches. And not only, it can be overwhelming, lengthy legislation, competitive frameworks, uncertainty about what applies and what doesn't apply. Colin, you sometimes describe this as a kind of a freeze syndrome, where doing nothing can feel safer, and which is what many people are feeling. What are you seeing in practice, and why is inaction not necessarily the safest response at the moment?
You answered the question to an extent. There is a lot of different legislation. Obviously, GDPR has been around for a while. Now we have the EU AI Act on top of that, and it can feel quite intangible. It can also, I think, feel like, how do we get ahead here? It's a very competitive world and there's a drive to adopt AI for efficiency gains to make sure that you're competitive regardless of the profession you're in. I think to some degree, it's the same for coaches and learning professionals, because our clients are all going through this rapid technological change. And we always talk about how the coach should be walking in the shoes of their clients. So I do think there's a responsibility for coaches and learning professionals to stay ahead of the game here. And I think in that surge to do that, it can feel quite difficult to, okay, now I need to know, am I doing everything? You're ticking all the boxes from a legal and compliance point of view. But, I think it's absolutely critical. And how I try and make this practical for learning professionals and coaches is not see them as two separate things. So if you look at a typical use case where you think AI could benefit it, whether that's before, during, or after the coaching session, and maybe later we can go into some of those examples, you think, okay, well, what are the tools that can actually deliver that? And importantly, what are some of the key compliance questions I need to be asking if I'm considering to use one of those tools? So I think just breaking it down to that level. But in order to do that, you do need some grounding foundations of AI governance and understanding, if not the full detail of things like the EU AI Act, just being really clear on what are the principles that we're talking about. Things like transparency, explainability, literacy, and what does that mean in practice for a coach who is, for example, using ChatGPT to help brainstorm a coaching session plan. So I think just breaking it down to that level is a good start, and having that basic literacy and that basic behavior of understanding how to look through a provider's terms is so important to take those first initial steps.
Thank you for that. Amber, you're not necessarily working with coaches, but you're coming from an organizational background as well, where data protection and compliance are very serious concerns for large organizations like technology providers. Where does the individual coach's responsibility actually begin from your point of view?
Talking about it from a rather than an organisational point of view, but the individual coach's point of view, I think as soon as you start to receive data about people, that's when you need to switch on and start to think about this. I'm receiving data about somebody. And, as Colin said, GDPR has been around for a long time, data protection, privacy laws around the time. This is just adding to it. So always have in your mind, I've got my GDPR compliance, and now AI is a layer on that. So as soon as data comes in, my most practical tip that I tell people to do, whether that's an organisation or an individual, is try and draw yourself a little map of the data, little flowchart, data in, where do I think it's going? Data in, it goes to an AI machine, or data in, it's going to Microsoft. Try and map it out as best you can. And then, as Colin said, try and find the documentation that backs it up. So whether that's going into Microsoft's terms, they're really hard to read. So this is not easy stuff for people. And really try and look and do that mapping and then try and follow the paperwork from that. I think we're all used to Microsoft and those types of tools. Where you need to take particular attention is the new stuff. So ChatGPT, Claude, any Otter AI, any of these kind of new AI tools, trying to get to grips with what their document says about what does it do with the data that I put into it? How does it protect it? Is it GDPR compliant? And I'm sure we'll come on to this in a minute. Does it train with the data that I put into it? So a really key question. The data that I've put into it, which comes from somebody else, someone else's personal data, what is it going to do with that data? And that is a question that you're trying to answer when you read the documentation by the provider.
This is a very helpful checklist almost. And I know, Colin, you've had your checklists. Maybe you have some updated ones. I know you've been on one of our webinars a couple of years ago, and you had a really thorough checklist as to what coaches should be mindful of. You both mentioned the AI EU Act, which is an important piece of legislation that it applies in Europe, but not only, because that's one of the things that coaches are not always mindful of. They're thinking that they're not in Europe, it doesn't apply to them, but it does in a sense. So I'd like to get into that in a moment, if you could explain that. I know there's a new deadline now in August for it, and there are some updates and some changes. What should coaching providers and organizations be paying attention to right now? Colin, if you can jump in here.
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure most people are aware of the AI Act, but as a bit of a refresh, what it is, it's essentially a governance framework which introduces a risk-based classification model that various different actors need to comply with. And depending how the system is categorized from low to prohibited risk, that will then determine the type of governance that is actually required. So there's a kind of a pyramid that details all of that. So from a practical point of view, I think where coaches need to be thinking is, what are the tools that I'm using and how do they fall into this risk framework? And this is something they don't call out explicitly in the Act, like they don't name specific tools, but they do give you a general overview. So some of the basic tools that we would typically use, like AI companions, would tend to be more limited risk type classification. In other words, they're more transparency and literacy obligations, which is different to, say, some of the higher risk categories where you would have to detail really big conformity assessments, etc. So I think that's more to provide some reassurance that typically the common tools that coaches would use day to day would fall under those limited risks. But essentially, in most cases, the coach would be defined as a deployer. So again, they would have less obligations than the actual developer of the system. There's a lot of, and I'm sure Amber can share on this as well, timelines have been moving quite a lot, and there's various different delays for various different reasons. As you said, the next deadline is the 2nd of August 2026, and that's where the general purpose AI enforcement actually takes place. There's new powers given to local authorities to actually ensure some of these guidelines are implemented. So that's more just to be aware that actually there is more of a chance that some of these fines could be applied. Basically, there's also new transparency requirements that apply. So organizations need to disclose when somebody is interacting with an AI system. And then what was due to also come into effect in August 26 was obligations around high risk AI, and they've now been deferred to 2nd of December 2027. So I think to recap a little bit, the key takeaways for coaches and learning professionals right now is understanding where AI is touching, going back to that map that Amber was referencing as well, understanding where is AI actually touching the journey? How might I classify that AI system, both in terms of the actual system, how I'm actually using that system? And then once I know how to classify that, I'm a bit more informed of saying, oh, what do I actually need to do now? So on a practical level, if I'm using AI to help with a session plan with a coach, the transparency obligations are that I need to tell my client that I'm doing that, understand, do they have any concerns? Do they want to opt out? To give them that option, and detail that both in verbal contracting and in written contracting. And thirdly, I would say, by the way, updating that conversation regularly, because what a client might feel today, they might be less comfortable about in their second session if maybe they're going into more personal topics of conversation, etc. So that's how I would break it down. And yes, be aware of the timelines, be aware of what the requirements are, but also bring it back to that principles-based approach and making sure your response is proportionate. You know, if you're using some tools and you're covering basic GDPR and not inputting client data, it's a lower risk activity in the grander scheme of things. So I think it's about finding that balance, but being really transparent with your client on how you're using those tools and the steps you're taking to mitigate any risk.
That's a very important point to make, because sometimes clients' awareness is changing as well. So coming back to it, almost recontracting when it comes to that, it's really important. Also in the context in which AI is developing, everything around AI is moving very fast. And I think people's awareness is changing as well with time. So what one might agree with now, for 2 months down the line, they may not be so inclined to, because they are more aware of certain things.
Absolutely. And I think they may be disclosing different information that is riskier as well. For example, special category data, if it's health related, that type of topic, you then have extra responsibility on how you're treating that data as well, I suppose.
Colin, you're in Ireland, so the AI EU Act for you is very vivid. Amber, you're sitting in the UK. How is that for you?
We don't have in the UK any AI legislation yet, so the general rules still apply. But if you're working with people in the EU, or your data might touch EU, say, for example, you're working with an organisation, you're sitting in the UK, but you're talking to someone in France, then the obligations might touch you. So you do need to be aware of these things. I think Colin made a really good point, which I say to everybody. This is about transparency. And the conversation you're having about contracting and being really open and disclosure, one of the key principles of the Act is transparency. So really focusing on principles is really helpful. I know this sounds complicated, but making sure that you're transparent. If you're sitting in the UK, we have GDPR, which also has very similar provisions about transparency. So just be aware it might bite. The other point I think is important for people to mention is I absolutely agree with Colin that for most uses by a coach, it is lower risk AI use. That is, you're at the lower end. So making sure you're transparent, talking about these things is great. I think where organizations are seeing it might bite, where higher risk is HR tools. So certain HR tools which organizations will implement using AI to make some decisions about promotions or hiring, you can become higher risk AI use at that point. Just for people to be aware, so generally it's fine. But if you were contributing to some sort of HR tool that makes some decisions about people, you're at the higher risk end, and you really need to think more about issues like transparency, but also bias. Probably not to go into today, but I just want people to be aware that you can tip into that higher risk for these HR AI tools. Definitely one to go and talk to your legal team about if you're in an organisation.
For a coach who is not building an AI product, but is using tools as ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, an AI note taker, or AI-enabled coaching platform, how might the act still affect them individually?
It's going to be lower risk. It's a lower risk use case. So it's about transparency, making sure that someone is aware that they are interacting with AI, making sure that you are not using the AI to take decisions about that person. You're using your own critical thinking skills. Is that being transparency points? So it's quite light touch. If you're not at the point of making AI tools yourself, you are using them. I think what's more interesting is the privacy issues around uploading people's data to those sorts of tools and what do they do with that data, whether they train with it.
Yeah, and I think added to the transparency, I'd suggest literacy is also a big area that's referenced within the EU AI Act and similar legislation. So at an organisational level, it can potentially be a bit more straightforward in that you train teams on, okay, we have a new tool and you do formal training. But as an individual practitioner, there's maybe a bit of more personal responsibility to say, well, what is the education I need on this tool right now? And it's what we've already talked about. It's just understanding what are the benefits, what are the risks of the tool, which, by the way, the provider of the team has an obligation to also discuss, what they are. So that should be clear within their marketing terms and within their terms of use. But for me as a practitioner, it's trying to digest that. And by the way, AI can help you with this as well. Again, this is a really safe use case, taking a publicly available terms from a provider and getting some insights from that, prompting the tool to act as a EU AI compliance officer, Act compliance officer, for example. So you get that downloadable, what as a practitioner, what are the obligations I have? And those obligations include being able to translate some of that back to the client in a way that is digestible and that they would understand. So here are the benefits, here are the risks of using the tool. I think what we'll get out of it is this. But some of the risks are data, even though I'll anonymize your data, some of the discussion and the content of the stories could be used to train another AI model somewhere. How do you feel about that? And having that open conversation. So yeah, I think literacy is critical, and understanding, if you're within an organization, what does that mean from making sure that the right teams get the right level of training according to the use cases they're working on. And if I'm an individual practitioner, how do I build that personal literacy myself, which is about understanding some of the basics of the legislation that governs it and understanding the terms of the tools that I'm using and how to translate that back in a digestible way to other stakeholders and to my clients.
Sounds brilliant and easy as you say it. There are surely very many frameworks, principles, and checklists available already. How can a coach distinguish between what is legally required, what is good governance, and what is simply recommended practice? And do you have a go-to place? And I'm asking both of you now for coaches to check out and make sure they've done their learning and checklist.
I would say something like Microsoft does have really good educational portals to help you with this stuff, as does Anthropic for Claude. So there's a lot of digestible guidance out there. There's a fantastic organisation called AI for Non-Techies, which looks at basic AI literacy. So you're right, it's difficult to know what do I legally have to do versus what's best practice versus what's this person trying to sell me. But I would start with the tool providers. It's in their interest for these tools to be really successful. They have obligations to be transparent, obligations to tell you what they do with data. And some of them do a pretty good job at saying that in a very plain way and an understandable way. So I would start with those. I don't know, Colin, if you've got any go-to places.
I think they're great tips. And as you say, Amber, I know all of the big providers often offer free training. So I think if you're a Claude user, go to that source as well to get the official trainings here. I think the EU AI Act itself, again, going to official sources like the European Commission or whoever is, and wherever that legislation is. And again, using AI tools to help you with that, being aware that there is, of course, some risk within that. But also to your question, Smaranda, I think there is a difference between, okay, what's legal compliance and then what is just how I feel as a coach and what will make me feel like I'm taking responsible choices here. And often there is an overlap between the two. But I think, thinking for yourself, what are your values? What is your starting point? What are your ethical principles? And actually using that as a starting point can be a good place to jump off, because I think we can definitely follow the legislation, but really understanding, well, what is important to me as a coach? And if you don't already have those principles or values, you can adopt them. There's many different sources out there. The ones I often quote are the UNESCO ethical principles. So they have various different principles around safety and security, multi-stakeholder governance, transparency and explainability. There's 10 of them. So you could have a look at those and say, well, which of these are most relevant to me? And actually a lot of those principles went into the foundations of the EU AI Act as well. So everybody's sort of adopting from each other here. But I think thinking, well, what of these values or principles are important to me and how is that my starting point? So that when I use a use case or when I create a use case and I've already determined that safety and security is a strong principle or core value, what is the question I'm asking about that use case that makes me say that I'm treating data safely and securely, and what is that process I have in place to make sure I'm doing due diligence with my client data before I approach a tool. And I think that then gives you a lot of personal security that you're actually working in line with your own principles in this topic as well.
I absolutely agree that legal obligations are the floor, but your principles might be that you want to act differently. And the UNESCO principles, which is at the OECD as well, I think have a good set of basic principles. And by and large, if you follow those, you are going to be complying with the law by default. I advise many different global organisations, and it's really interesting how these principles crop up all over the world. So you see Singapore have very, very similar principles, Australia, and as Colin said, they're all kind of stealing from each other with the best intentions.
That's the best way because it means we're all going into the same direction, at least. You brought some very important points there, both of you, and that's super helpful for coaches. I think coaches are already by default very mindful when it comes to confidentiality, data protection. So they've been put a lot in context in which those ethical questions came up a lot. Now with AI, there is the additional fear because you don't know what you should and what you shouldn't. And there are so many different tools. I wanted to bring in the question around, which is a question that coaches are asking a lot. Can I use free tools? There are very many tools out there and many of them you can use the free version. Yes. One of the questions that were asked most frequently is whether coaches should use free customer AI tools or pay for subscriptions. You know, how many subscriptions can you pay for? And you start this platform for this part of my coaching, the other platform and so on. There are too many things available. So what is your advice on that?
I would say for free tools, proceed with caution because I don't believe they're really free. They typically use your data to train the AI model. So they will use what you put into it to improve it. So you lose control over the data. Now, that might be fine if you're just doing a bit of brainstorming with no personal data. You just want to have the advantage of using AI as maybe a thinking partner. That's fine. But I would always be cautious. I don't particularly want AI companies learning from how I think. If you go to the next level up, which is you can quite often get a tool for quite low cost, say $10 to $20 a month. Again, by default, they will train on your data. You need to go into their settings. Sometimes it's quite difficult. You need to go in and find out, are they training on my data? And there's quite often a switch that you need to toggle off to say that they cannot use your data. Again, with those sorts of tools, they are not enterprise level secure tools. So again, treat with caution. They may not be training on your data, but do they actually protect your personal data in the way that you want them to? So that's where our point is about going to look at the documentation and saying, is this GDPR compliant as well? Because you need to be thinking about both things. First of all, what's the AI doing with my data? But also, is it GDPR compliant? They're slightly different things. Then you've got enterprise level tools, which unfortunately, if you're in a small practice, you might not be able to get access to. A lot of them have minimum seats. You might need to buy 5 licenses, for example, 10 licenses. That might not be possible for your organization. They typically have better security. They tend to have contractual provisions which say they comply with GDPR. And again, much easier to turn off that training. So really go into the settings and find out, is it training with my data? And then generally GDPR and most privacy regulations that you think about data minimization. Do I really need to put that into the machine? Can I do it in a different way? Can I anonymize it? Those sorts of things, which is something that we can only do as humans. This is not a tool thing. This is how do I act? So really minimizing that data that you put in is another great tip as well.
Yeah, and I think I won't add much to that. I think Amber covered it very comprehensively. I'm doing some work with a public sector organisation at the moment on assessing the landscape of enterprise tools and what fits according to their strategy and values. So this is active on my mind. But I think the enterprise level, of course, you get more data security with that, which is a shame in a way, because I think we should have a baseline expectancy that whatever tool we use should have a degree of security. So I think in essence, yes, the more enterprise you go, the better security levels that are there. But I would also, going back to what we talked about before, encourage really having an agnostic view of everything and a set of principles that you can use to determine, is this tool safe or not? Because there may be some free tools that actually, they are quite privacy conscious, and you can see this quite easily from just looking at their website or their terms. How are they even marketing themselves? Are they visibly showing this as a big issue that they're really focused on? I think that's a good signal to say they're going down that road. Now, of course, you should still verify that, because maybe they're saying it and not living it. But I think just being, again, going back to having a process to read through the terms, to understand what are the 5-6 things I'm looking out for here, and using that as your basis to go forward. And on the flip side, even if you do bring in a enterprise tool within your organization, like Microsoft have a good reputation for being security and conscious, but I think it doesn't take away from the fact that you should have an independent assessment of that, and you should have your own governance process to understand, is this in line again with the values of our organization? Does it meet the bar of our own standards? So that you don't just devolve that to some tool provider, that you actually, assess that for yourself and your organization. And in practice, what that means is you start with a basic 2-3 page AI governance policy. Again, going back over what we talked about, you're looking at the tools you have, you're understanding where do they sit from a risk categorization point of view. What are the governance processes for edge cases? What is the escalation process? Who's covering that role within the organization? So these are things now organizations, if they're not already thinking about, need to be thinking about. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect from the start if you're only using a couple of tools, but just having that framework that you can then adapt as you go forward is so important.
I wanted to bring in the question of AI note takers, because that's something that coaches are also repeatedly asking about. Should they use AI note takers? What should a coach consider before allowing a note taker into the coaching conversation? Is there anything else besides client permission? What additional questions would you ask yourself as a coach before bringing an AI note taker into your coaching session?
There's certain questions here, I think, starting back on the transparency piece. So firstly, has the client been made aware that there is a note taker present, and how are you covering that within the contracting? Because AI note takers are hugely useful, but maybe depending if it's a more personal conversation, you maybe don't want that. So I think having that open conversation first and foremost. Secondly, if you are using a note taker, being clear again and understanding the terms around how are they using your data. Is there an option for local storage of data, or is it a provider that's just based in the US and your data goes over there? Understanding these basic questions, I think, are important. And again, I've put together checklists on related topics in the past. Like everything, once you start using AI, nothing is 100% safe, right? But you are getting a benefit. So it's about managing that risk and what is the value you're going to get from an AI note taker. So being really clear on that. If there is a very clear value, and yeah, there absolutely can be, understanding, am I okay with the fact that my data is being used here in this way and that my client's data is being used? To give a personal story on this, I've used AI note takers in coaching sessions when I'm transparent with the client on it. Generally, they don't have an issue with it, but there have been instances where they've been clear that they don't want it, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, I would say on note takers, it's probably my number one question that I get asked people, can I use them? And just to add to Colin's point, I think if you're using one either individually or within your organization, be really clear on how long you're going to store those transcripts for. Because we always have this tendency, don't we, to keep things forever. And actually, the principles of GDPR mean we need to minimize the amount of data that perhaps we store forever. That's the first point. I think the second point is be wary of AI summaries that are generated from transcripts. They are hugely useful, and I use them all the time. But remember, it's a summary where AI has decided what's important in that conversation. I would say, and I use this in my legal work, I read the transcript as well as rely on the summary. Just be wary of the summary will surface things it thinks is important to you as a coach, not necessarily what is really important in the relationship.
That's a very important point to take into account. And Amber, one of the things that I was wondering about is what changing when coaching is commissioned by an organization and not one-to-one individual coaching. Whose consent and approval may be needed? The client, the sponsor, procurement, IT, the data protection team?
Oh gosh, good question, because there's lots and lots of people involved in that decision, isn't there? Let's go really zoom out to the organisational thing. What does your AI governance policy say about this? And what does your privacy policy say? Is this something that we want to do as an organisation? Going lower down, and the people actually involved in the coaching session itself, I think we need to be really transparent. What's going to happen to the data that comes out of these conversations? What happens to it? Where does it go? And what decisions might follow on from that data? Or what's going to be done with it once it's there? Procurement's interesting. So procurement should be helping you onboard these types of tools. And they need to be asking exactly the same type of questions that we're asking today about data security. What happens to it? How long is it stored for? Is it secure when it's on our systems? Who can access it? They should be helping you with all those sorts of questions. But I think the guidance is transparency, making sure that everybody within that coaching relationship, whether it's the company, the sponsor, the people having the conversation, are really, really clear on what's happening to it. And because it's likely to include sensitive personal data, they're consenting to it. It's not just assumed. It's something that we talk about and are really clear about.
Just wanted to bring a practical scenario. So we have a coach who is using a free generative AI tool to summarize anonymized notes after an executive coaching session. They've also used an AI note taker during the session with the client's verbal permission. And the entire coaching engagement is funded by the client's employer. What concerns do each of you immediately see, if any?
I would want to know a few things about the relationship. First of all, using the free AI on an anonymized basis, I'd really worry that you put so much information into there that it's not truly anonymized, so that together with other information, you're not really truly anonymized that data. Perhaps you've given enough away, so it's not truly anonymized. And the free AI tool, philosophically, I don't like people training from my data. So I'd go in and make sure that training is switched off in some way. Does my client know actually that I'm doing this? So I think at this point, we haven't really told our client that we might be using AI as an assistant here. And I would definitely, thinking about sort of that sycophantic point, hopefully I've got that AI literacy so that I know that AI can lead me down a path and agree with me. So am I really using that critical thinking in that scenario? On the AI note taker with verbal permission, I think I'd want to see something written, really. I'd want to see it as part of my relationship with the client to say, this is what I use, this is how I use it. Please ask me any questions. And again, I'd be making sure that it's secure. Quite a lot of coaching conversations would include sensitive data. So you really need to make sure that you've got that explicit consent to using it. And then the coaching funding, everyone in that chain needs to be really, really clear on what it's for, where the data gets passed. Just because it's funded doesn't mean that your employer gets access to everything. You really need to be clear. So Colin, as the expert coach, will know way more than me, but just because it's funded doesn't mean you just pass information around willy-nilly.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, the transparency between all of those parties is very important around what is happening. And if there is funding from the organization, probably responsibility lies between the coach and the coachee to share what's happening and how that budget is being used and what steps have been taken to minimize any issues of how data is being shared, stored, and that there was transparency, etc., etc. So I think when you do all of that, I think you're already going beyond maybe what a lot of organizations are doing. But I think just getting that ball rolling and building those chains of communications up between the relevant parties.
Thank you for that. I think we've covered a lot. So for a coach listening who already uses AI but has never formally reviewed their practice, what should they do this week after listening to this interview?
I think to recap some of the key points, do a mini audit of where you're using already AI within your work, whether it's directly with clients or for your own business and marketing purposes. I would just capture everything. Where are you already using it? What are some of the tools that you're using it for? Have I covered those basic questions around how I'm handling my client data? Do I have a general understanding, especially if I'm operating within the EU? how these systems classify from a risk point of view. And once I know that, you're taking some basic steps to ensure that I'm being compliant. And I think overall, I know we're talking a lot about compliance here, but every leader we coach is facing the exact same version of these exact questions. What do I trust? When do I automate? How do I protect the people I'm responsible for while moving my organization forward? So I think it's not just the right thing to do, but actually by upskilling in this area, you're really building your authority and credibility with these leaders that you're coaching who face these exact same challenges. So I think for me, that should give an extra motivation to take some of these basic steps.
I fully agree with Colin's first step, a mini audit. And that's where my drawings come in. I draw the relationships, draw where the data's going and follow that. So definitely mini audit. Make sure you've collected all the documentation related to the AI tools that you're using so you can use it alongside your audit. And then transparency, really asking yourself, if I had to explain to a disgruntled client what happened to their data, how would I do that? And would they feel that I've protected it? Would they feel that I've used AI in a responsible way? So definitely mini audit and focus on transparency.
Well, thank you both so much. It was very informative, and I hope our audience has gained a lot from listening to this. Our entire series is around ethics and trust. So I think these two elements are weaved in our conversation. As a final question for both of you, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to share with our audience when it comes to ethics, trust, and responsibility?
I think, as I mentioned, just understanding what ethics and trust and responsibility means to you as well. Like we've talked a lot about the EU AI Act and different principles, but really doing that personal inner work yourself. Like, what does ethical practice mean and look like to me? And getting those principles aligned with yourself really gives you that starting point. And I think even by explaining your process of doing that with your client, as I do in my contracting at the start of coaching sessions, that in itself can then build up that trust that you're having that conversation about these topics.
I think what's really clear from the conversation is a lot of this is principles based. And I think, just repeating really Colin's view, the law is there as a baseline. I think being really clear on your own personal principles. It's really clear from how AI governance is being rolled out throughout the globe that principles is really where it's at. So transparency and accountability. And what does that mean for me in the role that I've got? So not just having big words, but actually what does transparency actually mean for me in the size of organization or my practice, and making those principles real.
Where can people find you? And are there any resources that you'd like to share with our audience? By the way, we can upload those on our website. So if you want to share anything.
Yeah, super. So Colin Cosgrove on LinkedIn is probably where I'm most active. And my website is movismo.com. That's MOVIZMO.com. Either of those two places, you can get in touch with me and find some of my resources as well.
And for me, yes, active on LinkedIn. So I'm Amber Foster _Blake. Also my website, which is humansuperpowers.com. So we put a number of resources on there, and we've got some fantastic prompt packs on there about how to think differently with AI and how to make sure that you're keeping your creativity. So love it if people would go and have a look and give us feedback on those.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great conversation. What I take away from this conversation is that responsible governance begins by making the invisible visible. Before we can make informed decisions, we need to understand where AI is touching the coaching journey, what information is moving through it, and who else may be involved. Mapping the data, reading the provider's terms and conditions, and speaking openly with the client may sound basic, but these are essential practices of trust. I was also struck by the importance of returning to the conversation. Consent and comfort are not fixed. The topics discussed in coaching may become more personal. The technology may change. The client's awareness may evolve. Transparency, therefore, needs to be ongoing, not treated as a single clause signed at the beginning. I would love to hear what practical action you will take from this episode. Please share your takeaways on your preferred podcast platform or join the conversation through our LinkedIn posts. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To learn more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our website at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events for your continuing professional development.